A 24-year-old with no name, no fortune, and a surname he still spelled the foreign way, was handed a starving, half-mutinous army and told to hold a mountain front against two empires at once. He had no aristocratic blood to recommend him. He had no money to buy influence. He had an accent his own soldiers laughed at. And within a single year, that man had conquered the richest land in Europe and was sitting across the table from the ambassadors of kings, dictating the borders of a continent as if he had been born to it. The story everyone thinks they know begins with a crown, a cathedral in Paris, a pope brought in to bless the moment, and a small man lifting the imperial crown out of the pope's hands and setting it on his own head. That scene is real. We'll get there. But it is the ending of a climb, not the start of one. And the climb is far stranger than the crown. Because nothing about this man's beginning pointed anywhere near a throne. That is what the coronation hides. If you had walked through the France of his youth and been asked to pick, out of all the young officers in the kingdom, the one who would one day rule half of Europe, you would not have picked him. Almost no one did. He was too poor, too foreign, too odd, too far from the rooms where power actually lived. The astonishing part of the story isn't that a great man rose. It's that this particular boy, mocked, broke, an outsider in every sense, got anywhere at all. If you find that as strange as I do, subscribe and stay with this channel, because the whole of this story is built out of moments like the ones we're about to walk through. Real ones, documented ones, where a single decision tipped everything. So let's go back before the army, before the general's stars, before anyone in Paris had heard his name. Let's start on an island that wasn't even French yet. He was born in the summer of 1769 in a town called Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. And Corsica, at that exact moment in history, was one of the freshest wounds in Europe. For decades, the island had belonged, at least on paper, to the Republic of Genoa. But Genoa was old, tired, and short of money. So it did something that tells you a great deal about how the 18th century worked. It sold the island. It handed Corsica over to France the way you might offload a house you can no longer afford to heat. A transfer of a whole people, their language, their villages, their pride, settled in an office by men who had never set foot there. The Corsicans did not accept this quietly. They had fought for their independence, and they fought France for it too. Only about a year before the boy was born, French troops crushed the Corsican rebels in the hills. So picture the household he entered. His family were minor nobility, Italian-speaking, proud of a status that, on that poor island, meant more in name than in gold. His father had been close to the leaders of the independence fight, and then, when the fight was lost, made his peace with the French and took what advantages the new masters offered. This was survival, not treachery, but it left a strange inheritance for the child. He was born a subject of a country that had conquered his home in living memory. His first language was a dialect of Italian. He would spell his own name the Corsican Italian way, Bonaparte, long into adulthood, before he ever softened it into the French, Bonaparte, the world remembers. Think about what that does to a boy. He grew up hearing that his island had been free and had lost that freedom to the very kingdom whose uniform he would one day wear. He grew up as an insider and an outsider stitched together, noble enough to have doors opened, foreign enough that everyone behind those doors could smell where he came from. That contradiction sat in him for years. As a teenager, he wasn't dreaming of ruling France. He was writing furious little essays about Corsican liberty, idolizing the island's rebel leader, imagining himself as a patriot of the place France had taken. The man who would become the great symbol of French glory began as a boy who resented France with his whole heart. That resentment matters because it explains the engine that ran underneath everything he later did. He never once, in his youth, had the luxury of belonging, and a person who does not belong learns to watch. He watches how the powerful behave, how the rooms are arranged, who really decides things, and who only pretends to. He learns the machinery from the outside, the way a locksmith learns a lock he isn't allowed to own. That skill, reading a system he was excluded from, would one day let him take that system apart and rebuild it with himself at the center. But first, the island boy had to leave the island, and the way he left tells you everything about the cage he was born into. His family's minor nobility qualified him, just barely, for something precious: a royal scholarship to a military school on the French mainland. So, at the age of 9 years old, he was put on a boat, taken away from everything he had ever known, and delivered to a school in a cold town in eastern France, surrounded by boys who were richer, taller, more French, and entirely unimpressed by him. Sit with that for a moment. A small boy, barely able to speak the language properly, dropped alone into a school full of the sons of dukes and counts. He spoke French with a thick Corsican accent, and the other boys heard it instantly. They mocked the accent. They mocked the island. They mocked the very way he wrote his name. To them, he was the foreigner, the poor scholarship case from a place they thought of the way you might think of the far edge of the map, remote, backward, faintly ridiculous. Now, there are two things a bullied outsider can become. He can shrink and disappear into himself and let the mockery define the size of his life. Or he can decide, coldly, that he will beat every one of them at the one game where family name counts for nothing. He chose the second. While the aristocratic boys coasted on the certainty that their futures were already arranged by blood, he buried himself in the subjects where results were the only thing that mattered: mathematics, geography, the hard skeleton of how battles are actually won. He read history the way a starving man eats. He read about the great conquerors of the ancient world, the men who had bent the map to their will with nothing but nerve and calculation. He wasn't reading to be entertained. He was studying them the way an apprentice studies a master, taking notes on how a man with no right to greatness had seized it anyway. And he was fast. When he moved on to the elite military academy in Paris, he compressed a 2-year course into one. His examiners noticed the obsessive focus, artillery, mathematics, the geography of a battlefield. He wasn't charming. He wasn't well connected. He had none of the easy grace the noble cadets carried like a birthright. What he had was a kind of relentless, grinding capability that made him impossible to ignore even when everyone wanted to. By 16, he had his commission, a junior officer in an artillery regiment, the branch of the army where mathematics decided everything and social polish decided almost nothing. Of all the paths in the army, he had walked into the one where a poor outsider had the best possible chance. Because a cannon does not care who your grandfather was. The trouble was that he graduated into a peacetime army. And a peacetime army is one of the slowest, dullest, most suffocating places an ambitious young man can find himself. There was no war to distinguish yourself in. There was no crisis to make you indispensable. There was only the long, gray grind of garrison duty, of promotions that crawled forward by seniority, of a hierarchy where a brilliant nobody could work for 20 years and still be outranked by an aristocratic fool who had never once heard a shot fired in anger. So imagine those years. This is not the thundering hero of the paintings. This is a broke junior lieutenant in cheap rented rooms in provincial French towns, often skipping meals to save money, sending part of his small pay back to his family, reading late into the night by whatever light he could afford. He devoured books, history, philosophy, the theory of government, the campaigns of dead generals. He wrote essays and long, ambitious notes, some of them still burning with that old Corsican patriotism. He was, by any ordinary measure, going nowhere. A talented, frustrated young man watching the years drain away in a career that had no room to reward what he actually was. And all the while, above his head, the kingdom he barely belonged to was beginning to crack. He couldn't see the whole of it yet. No one could. But the France he had been dropped into as a boy was a country running out of money, run by a court that had lost touch with the people it ruled, held together by a rigid old order that reserved everything worth having. The ranks, the offices, the honors, for men born into the right families. It was, from top to bottom, a machine built to keep men like him exactly where they were, below. For a poor, gifted, furious young officer, that machine looked permanent. It had stood for centuries. It looked like the shape of the world itself, the ceiling he would spend his whole life pressed against. He had no idea that the entire ceiling was about to be blown off, and that when it came down, it would bury the old aristocracy and clear a road for exactly the kind of man the old world had been designed to hold down. The ceiling came down not slowly, but all at once, and from below. In the summer of 1789, a hungry, furious crowd in Paris stormed a royal fortress prison, and within days the whole apparatus that had held France in place for centuries began to sag. The details of what followed filled decades of history books, but strip it down to what mattered for a poor artillery lieutenant, and it comes to a single stunning fact. The old rule, the unwritten law that said command belonged to men of noble blood, that the higher ranks were reserved by birth, that rule was suddenly, violently, dead. Watch what that did to the army. The officer corps of the French army had been an aristocratic club. To reach the top, you needed the right name, the right connections, the right great-grandfather. And now, the revolution was declaring war on exactly those men. The aristocrats who had monopolized command began to do the sensible thing for their own survival. They ran. They fled across the borders, thousands of them, colonels and generals and captains abandoning their posts, joining armies of exile abroad, waiting for the madness to burn itself out. And when they ran, they left behind something no ambitious outsider had ever seen in his lifetime. Empty chairs at the top of the army. A vacuum where the ceiling used to be. Now imagine the young man who had spent his whole life pressed against that ceiling, watching lesser men float above him on nothing but their family names. Suddenly, the men above him were gone. Suddenly, France was at war with half the monarchies of Europe, all of them determined to march in and put the king back on his throne. And the desperate young republic needed one thing more than anything else: competent officers who could actually fight. It no longer had the luxury of asking who your grandfather was. It needed men who could win. It needed men exactly like him. I want you to feel how rare this is in history. For most people, in most eras, the shape of your life is decided before you're born. The ceiling is real, and it does not move. And then, once in a great while, a whole social order collapses at precisely the moment a hungry, prepared, obsessive outsider is standing there, ready to climb. The revolution did not create his talent. He had that already, sharpened through all those broke and lonely years of reading by candlelight. What the revolution did was tear the roof off the cage. And a man who has studied conquerors his whole life does not need to be told twice when the door is open. The place where he walked through it was a port town in the south of France called Toulon. By this point, the revolution had turned on itself, devouring its own in waves of executions, and much of the country had risen against the radicals in Paris. Toulon was one of those rebel cities. And Toulon had done something unforgivable. It had opened its harbor to the enemy. The great naval base, home to a huge part of the French fleet, had handed itself over to a combined British and Spanish force. Foreign warships now sat in a French harbor. Foreign soldiers held the town. For the young republic, it was a catastrophe and a humiliation stacked on top of each other. So the republic sent an army to take it back, and that army was a mess. Underfed, badly organized, led by men who owed their positions more to political loyalty than military skill. They laid siege to Toulon, and they got nowhere. They flung themselves at the town's defenses and were thrown back. The men were exhausted and demoralized, and the officer commanding the artillery had been wounded and put out of action, leaving a gap. Into that gap stepped a captain of artillery, a thin, intense young man from Corsica, who had arrived almost by accident and now found himself in charge of the guns. And he did something the men above him had not done. He looked at the whole problem instead of the piece of it in front of him. Everyone else was staring at the town, thinking about how to break through the walls and the trenches and the defenders. He looked past the town, at the water. He understood something the others were missing entirely. Toulon itself was not the real target. The reason the town could not fall was the enemy fleet sitting safely in the harbor, supplying the defenders, protecting them, ready to evacuate them if things ever went wrong. As long as those ships were safe, the siege was pointless. You could take the town street by street, and the fleet would simply carry everyone away. But the fleet was not, in fact, entirely safe, because the harbor had a choke point, a piece of high ground on a promontory that commanded the entrance to the inner harbor. Get guns onto that hill, and you could rain fire down on the anchored ships. And a fleet that cannot sit safely at anchor is a fleet that must leave. And a garrison whose escape route and lifeline is threatened will not stay to be destroyed. Take one hill, and the whole thing unravels. The fleet flees, the defenders panic, the town falls into your hands. He saw the entire siege turning on a single point of land, the way an entire door turns on one small hinge. The trouble was that he was a junior officer, and the men above him were not convinced. He had to argue for it, push for it, force his plan on doubting superiors who outranked him and did not much like being lectured by a young Corsican with grand ideas. This is one of the most revealing things about the whole story, and it repeats again and again in his life. He was not merely brilliant. He was insistent, to the point of being immovable. He would not let a good idea die in a committee. He pressed, he calculated, he found the officers who would listen and worked around the ones who wouldn't, until his plan became the army's plan. And then he did the other thing that separated him from 1,000 equally clever men who never rose. He was there. When the assault finally came, on the key fortifications guarding that vital high ground, he was not behind the lines with a map. He was in it, in the fighting, in the dark and the chaos and the mud. And he was wounded. A bayonet gash to the thigh, close enough to the enemy to be within reach of one. The men saw that. Soldiers always know the difference between a commander who spends them and a commander who bleeds beside them. The hill fell. The guns went up. The fire came down on the harbor. And exactly as he had predicted, the enemy fleet could no longer stay. The ships pulled out, taking thousands of terrified townspeople with them, and Toulon dropped back into French hands. The young captain, who had walked into that siege as a nobody, walked out of it as a general. He was 24 years old, promoted to brigadier general on the strength of a single, correct, ruthlessly executed idea. But calling it a promotion undersells what happened. A promotion is a step. This was a transformation.
He had entered as one anonymous artillery officer among many, and emerged as a man the government in Paris now knew by name. A man with a reputation for seeing the thing everyone else missed, and then making it happen no matter who stood in the way. And then, having risen, he nearly fell just as fast. Politics in revolutionary France was a guillotine that swung both ways. The faction he had attached himself to was overthrown, its leaders executed, and for a dangerous stretch he was under suspicion, briefly arrested, his career suddenly hanging by a thread. He spent an anxious period out of favor, out of a real command, back to being a young man watching from below, wondering if the door had swung shut again. It's worth remembering this. His rise was not a smooth escalator. It was a scramble up a cliff face where the handholds kept crumbling, and more than once he was one bad week away from vanishing into obscurity, or worse. What saved him was a mob in the streets of Paris. By this point, the revolution had produced a new government, and that government was fragile, unloved, and surrounded by enemies. In the autumn of 1795, a large armed crowd, royalists and the discontented, tens of thousands of them, marched on the seat of the government in the heart of Paris. The men in power had almost no one to defend them. They were about to be swept away. And in their panic, they turned to the young general who happened to be in the city and available, the one who had made his name at Toulon. He took the job, and he did something that most men, offered that command in that moment, would have flinched from. He brought up cannon into the narrow streets of the capital. When the enormous crowd pressed forward toward the government's position, he did not negotiate, did not wait, did not hesitate. He opened fire on them. Cannon loaded with grape shot, clusters of small iron balls that turn a single artillery piece into a giant shotgun, fired directly into a mass of people packed into a Paris street. The crowd broke. Hundreds fell. The attack on the government collapsed in a matter of minutes, drowned in smoke and blood on the steps of a church and in the streets around it. It was over almost as fast as it began. Notice what the story does not tell us. What was going on inside him as he gave that order. The sources don't hand us his private feelings, and I won't invent them. What we have is the act itself, cold and clear. Faced with a moment where power was simply lying in the street, waiting for someone with the nerve to defend it, he was the man with the nerve. And the government he saved understood exactly what they now owed him. They were in his debt. They had seen, up close, what he was willing to do. And gratitude, in a frightened government, tends to come dressed as opportunity. The opportunity they gave him was a command. Not a glamorous one. On paper, it looked like a graveyard. They gave him the army fighting on the Italian front, the least fashionable theater of the war, the one everyone treated as a sideshow. And the army they handed him was in ruins. It was unpaid, sometimes for months. It was ragged and half-starved, short of boots and bread and gunpowder, its morale rotted through by neglect. The generals before him had achieved nothing there. It was, by every reasonable expectation, a place where reputations went to quietly die. He arrived in the spring of 1796 and turned that expectation upside down within weeks. The first thing he did was not a maneuver. It was a promise.
He told those starving, resentful men that on the other side of the mountains lay the richest plains in the world. Food, wine, cities, money, and that he was going to lead them into it. He would feed them off the enemy's own country. And then, he made good on it, faster than anyone thought possible. He drove his army through the passes and fell on the forces arrayed against him, the armies of an old kingdom and the enormous, ancient empire that dominated the region. He did not fight them all at once. He moved with a speed that his slow, methodical enemies simply could not match, striking one force before it could join with another, beating them in pieces, appearing where he was not expected, and vanishing before they could pin him down. Battle after battle, in a single dizzying year, he shattered armies far larger and better supplied than his own hungry, boot-worn men. And as the victories piled up, something in his conduct began to shift. And this is the part that matters far more than the battles. A general wins battles and reports them to his government. That is the job. But this young general started doing something else. He began to make policy. He signed truces on his own authority. He reorganized conquered territory, set up new political arrangements, and stripped the wealth of the lands he crossed, sending back to Paris not just victory dispatches, but wagon loads of gold and priceless art, buying the loyalty of the government that was supposed to be commanding him. And when the great empire he had been fighting finally sued for peace, it was not the government in Paris that sat down to dictate the terms. It was him. He negotiated the peace himself, drawing new borders across Europe, handing whole territories from one power to another, deciding the fate of ancient states with his own signature. A general, technically the servant of his government, carving up a continent as though he were already its master. Read the letters and dispatches from those months, and you can feel the change in the voice. He is no longer writing like a soldier awaiting orders. He is writing like a head of state who happens, for the moment, to be wearing a uniform. The men in Paris who had given him that forgotten command were beginning to realize, with a growing unease, that they had not so much appointed a general as unleashed one. He had gone out to win a campaign and had come back the most famous man in France, richer in glory than the government that outranked him, and plainly no longer thinking of himself as anyone's instrument. An ordinary victorious general at this point consolidates. He takes the fame, banks it, waits for the next war, plays the long game inside the system. But he was not thinking like an ordinary general anymore. He was thinking about scale, about how to become larger than any post the Republic could offer him, about how a man might leap clear over the entire government that had made him. And so, instead of resting on the greatest triumph of his life, he began to look east, past Europe entirely, toward an idea so enormous and so reckless that his own government was happy to approve it, partly to keep him busy, partly to get this dangerously popular young man out of Paris and safely far away. He was going to sail an army across the sea into the land of the pharaohs and chase a dream of glory that no French general had touched since the ancient world. It was the moment his ambition stopped being the ambition of a soldier and became something else entirely. The gamble of a man who had begun to believe there was no ceiling left above him at all. He sailed east with an army, a fleet, and something almost unheard of for a military expedition. A small city's worth of scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers packed in alongside the soldiers. That detail alone tells you how his mind had swelled. He was not going to Egypt merely to fight. He was going to conquer a civilization, study it, catalog it, absorb it, and come home as something more than a general who had won a war. He imagined himself in the line of the ancient world conquerors he had read about by candlelight as a mocked boy.
The whole thing was a dream of glory on a scale that no French commander had reached in 1,000 years, and at first it worked well enough to feed the dream. He landed his army, took the great cities of the Nile, and won a crushing victory in the shadow of the pyramids against a force of warriors whose way of fighting belonged to another age. His scholars fanned out and began the work that would, among other things, uncover a certain slab of inscribed stone that eventually unlocked the ancient Egyptian language for the modern world. For a few weeks, the fantasy looked achievable. Then the sea took it all back. His fleet was anchored in a bay on the Egyptian coast, and a British squadron found it there. In a single night of fighting, the British destroyed almost the entire French fleet. One great warship exploded so violently that men reported the blast being heard for miles. And when the smoke cleared, the French navy in that theater simply no longer existed. And with the fleet gone, the whole magnificent gamble turned inside out in an instant. The army that had come to conquer Egypt was now trapped in Egypt. There was no way home, no reinforcements, no fresh supplies. Tens of thousands of European soldiers stranded in the heat and dust, thousands of miles from France, cut off from the world by an ocean now owned by their enemy. What followed was a slow, grinding misery. Disease swept through the ranks. Plague appeared in the camps. Men who had marched under the pyramids dreaming of empire now died of fever in filthy tents, or thirst on desert roads, or in a brutal campaign pushing north into Syria that battered itself to pieces against the walls of a single, stubborn fortress and had to turn back. The great expedition rotted where it stood, and the commander who had promised these men glory and riches watched his impossible dream drain into the sand. And here is the moment that tells you exactly what kind of man he was, stripped of all the paintings and the myths. When he learned that back home the political situation was unstable, that France was reeling under new defeats in Europe, that the government was weak and hated and vulnerable, he saw not a disaster, but an opening. And so he did the coldest thing in this entire story. He abandoned his army. He slipped away from Egypt in secret with a tiny handful of chosen men, boarded a ship, and left tens of thousands of soldiers behind in the desert, leaderless, plague-ridden, and doomed, to sail home and seize a far bigger prize than anything the Nile could offer.
Think about the individual human weight of that. Somewhere in that abandoned army was a soldier who had followed him from Toulon, who had crossed the Alps with him into Italy, who had believed every promise. That man was now left to die of fever or captivity in a foreign land, while the general who had led him there sailed home to reach for a crown. The army he deserted would eventually be forced to surrender to the British and be shipped back, a broken remnant of what had set out. It was one of the great catastrophes of his career, and by the time the full scale of the failure was clear, he had already used his sudden return to make himself the most powerful man in France. Because when his ship reached the French coast, the news of his defeats had not caught up with him. What had arrived first was the old legend, the conqueror of Italy, the man of Toulon, the young general who won. Crowds cheered him through the streets, and waiting for him in Paris were plotters who needed exactly what he was: a famous soldier the public trusted, a sword to put behind a plan to overthrow the weak and unpopular government from the inside. That plan came to its head on a November day that history remembers by its date on the revolutionary calendar, the 18th of Brumaire. The scheme was supposed to be smooth: frighten the legislature into leaving Paris on a pretext, gather the lawmakers at a palace outside the city, and there, surrounded by loyal troops, pressure or force them into dissolving the government and handing power to a new arrangement with the general at its center. On paper, a quiet coup dressed up as a legal reform. In practice, it very nearly fell apart. And it fell apart because of him. He was a genius on a battlefield and a disaster in a debating chamber. When he strode into the assembly to address the lawmakers and demand they hand over power, he did not overawe them. He rambled. He lost his thread. He made vague, threatening, incoherent statements that alarmed rather than persuaded.
And the legislators, many of whom had smelled the coup coming and hated it, turned on him. They shouted him down. They surged toward him, jostling him, some reportedly grabbing at him, cries of outlaw and tyrant ringing through the hall. The man who had faced cannon fire at Toulon was physically manhandled by furious politicians and had to be pulled out of the chamber by grenadiers, shaken, pale, the whole scheme teetering on the edge of collapse in front of a hostile mob of lawmakers. The coup was saved not by his eloquence, but by his brother, who happened to be the presiding officer of the lower house that day. His brother rushed outside to the troops waiting in the courtyard, and, instead of admitting the truth, that the general had just been rejected and roughed up inside, told the soldiers a different story. He told them that assassins inside the chamber had tried to murder their general with knives. To make the point unforgettable, according to the accounts, he drew a sword and swore he would run his own brother through with it if that brother ever betrayed the cause of liberty. It was pure theater, and it worked. The soldiers, primed to believe their beloved commander had been attacked, formed up, fixed bayonets, and marched into the legislative chamber. And then the Republic died, not in a great battle, but in a farce. At the sight of a column of soldiers advancing with fixed bayonets, the lawmakers who had been so brave a moment before broke and ran. They scrambled out of windows. They fled across the palace grounds in the November cold, some of them reportedly still in the robes of their office, tumbling through the gardens to get away from the steel. The chamber was cleared in minutes. That night, a rump of compliant legislators was rounded up and made to vote the new order into existence. A form of government that had been born in the storming of a prison a decade earlier, that had executed a king and drowned itself in its own blood chasing an ideal of liberty, ended in an afternoon of shouting and running men and a lie about knives that never existed. He came out of that chaotic day as first consul, in name one of three, in reality the master of France. And what he did with that power over the next years is a case study in how a republic is hollowed out from within while keeping all its old furniture in place. He kept the language of the revolution. He kept the appearance of consultation. He held grand public votes, plebiscites, asking the people to approve each expansion of his authority. And the numbers came back, overwhelmingly, suspiciously, in his favor. The votes were managed, inflated, in places simply invented. The results were announced before they could plausibly have been counted. It was the machinery of democracy operated as a stage set, giving an air of the people's blessing to a power that answered to no one but him. First, he was consul for 10 years, then consul for life. Each step wrapped in a vote that looked free and was not. And then he reached for the last, most audacious step of all. He would make himself an emperor. Consider how strange this was. France had cut off its king's head barely a decade before. It had fought and bled and terrorized itself in the name of ending kings forever. And now, the man the revolution had raised up was going to put a crown on his own head and found a new hereditary monarchy, an empire, out of the wreckage of the republic that had made him. To give the thing the weight of the old sacred order, he summoned the Pope himself from Rome to Paris for the coronation. The head of the Catholic Church, who for centuries had crowned emperors and kings, was made to travel across the Alps and wait, in effect, on the convenience of a man from Corsica. The ceremony took place in the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in the winter of 1804. And in the middle of it came the gesture that has echoed for 2 centuries. The tradition was ancient and clear. The Pope crowns the emperor. The Church confers the authority. The monarch receives his power from God through the hands of the Church. But when the moment came, he did not kneel and let the Pope place the crown upon him. He took the crown into his own hands, turned away from the altar, and set it on his own head himself. Whatever precisely was said or planned behind the scenes, and historians still debate exactly how choreographed it was, the meaning of the act was unmistakable and deliberate. He owed his crown to no church and no God and no bloodline. He had made himself. The mocked scholarship boy, the broke lieutenant reading Conquerors by candlelight, had reached up and crowned himself Emperor of the French, with the Pope reduced to a witness in his own ceremony. Now go back to the very beginning of all this. An outsider from a conquered island, laughed at for his accent, born a subject of the country he now ruled as its emperor. The full impossibility of it only lands when you hold both ends of the story at once. That is the whole arc, and if it grips you the way it grips me, subscribe and stay with the channel, because the rise is only half of any story like this, and the fall of a man who has crowned himself is always the stranger half. But first, the summit, because within a year of putting that crown on his own head, he fought the battle that stands as the highest point of his entire life, the moment when he was, without exaggeration, the master of Europe. The enemies of France had formed a new alliance to bring him down, and 2 of the great empires of the Old World marched against him. He met them in the cold of early December, on rolling ground near a village in what is now the Czech lands. The battle would be remembered forever as Austerlitz. And it is remembered because it was not merely won, it was designed. He did something that looked, to his opponents, like weakness. He deliberately made his army appear vulnerable. He gave up a piece of high ground that any cautious general would have held, thinned out one wing of his line, and generally arranged things to look as though he were unsure, overextended, ripe for the taking. He was baiting a trap. He wanted his enemies to see an opportunity and lunge at it. And they did. Convinced they had caught him off balance, the Allied armies poured their strength into the attack he had invited, shifting huge numbers of men to smash the weakened flank and roll up his army. The instant they committed to that move, they had lost, and only he knew it. Because in doing so, they had stripped the center of their own line, the very high ground they had abandoned. Through the freezing morning fog, he had hidden the real strength of his army, waiting. When the sun burned through the mist, he launched a hammer blow straight up at the now undefended heights in the middle of the enemy position. His troops seized the high ground, split the Allied army in 2, and then turned and fell on the flanking force from behind and above, trapping it. It was less a battle than a mechanism, a beautifully cruel machine that closed exactly as he had built it to close. The Allied army came apart. Thousands were driven onto frozen ponds, the ice giving way beneath them under fire. 3 emperors had ridden onto that field that morning, the Emperor of France and the 2 monarchs whose armies had come to destroy him. By the end of the day, only one of them still stood as a victor, and the 2 great old empires were beaten, shattered, suing for terms. It was a triumph so complete
that it seemed to belong to another category from ordinary victory. Stand on that battlefield in the last light of that day. The fog is gone. The ice on the ponds is broken and dark with what it swallowed. And on the rise stands a man who was born on an island France had just finished conquering, who was mocked for his accent by boys who are now dead or exiled, who read about conquerors when he had nothing, and who now, at this single frozen moment, is the most powerful human being on the continent. His family sits on thrones he has handed them. His borders swallow half of Europe. Kings write to him as their superior. There has been nothing like it in the West since the fall of the ancient empire he once dreamed of matching. He had reached, at last, the top of everything, the place where there truly was no ceiling left above him. And that is exactly where the crack runs deepest. Though on that evening, no one could see it clearly. The very things that carried him to the summit, the restlessness that could never stop conquering, the belief that no ceiling existed, the willingness to abandon an army in the desert or a republic on the floor of a chamber if it served the climb, those were not achievements he could set down now that he had won. They were the engine of the man, and an engine like that does not idle. He would keep reaching, keep expanding, keep making new enemies faster than he could destroy the old ones, until the same appetite that lifted a nobody to the throne of Europe would drag the emperor into the snows of Russia, and in the end, onto a rock in the middle of the ocean, alone. The boy nobody bet on had won the whole table. And the terrible truth of a man who cannot stop is that winning the whole table is not the end of the story. It is only the highest place from which to fall.